Is it going?
It takes a little bit to go through.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Language Documentation Training Center webinar workshop. My name is Greg Vondiziano. I am a PhD student here at the University of Hawaii. And today we are going to be talking about morphology and syntax. So we're just going to give a couple of minutes here to let some stragglers join in. And then we'll get started. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourselves, those of you who are present. And if you have any experience doing morphological or syntactic work, do let us know. You can let us know what languages you work on or what kind of experience you have, etc. And while we're waiting, I'll just introduce myself a little bit more. So like I said, I'm a PhD student here in linguistics, and I work with the Austronesian languages of Taiwan. So I work with Philippine-type languages and have a pretty decent knowledge of English and Chinese in addition. So as we're talking through the content of the workshop, I will probably be making reference to those languages. So for those of you who also work on Philippine languages, that'll be relevant to you. And for those of you who do not, it'll be some interesting typological information that you can put in your back pocket for later. All right, so let's take a look, see how many people we've got. 2 people. All right, so we're going to wait a little bit longer, let some more folks join in. 3 people, excellent, welcome. Glad to have you here. Let's see, can I get rid of this little thing? Hide. Yes, I can. Oops. There we go.
Sneak peek.
All right, what are we at? Still 3? Okay. We'll give a couple more minutes. Yeah. Have we gotten any comments?
Just good morning from Pakistan.
Good morning. Hello, welcome. Glad to have some folks from the other side of the world joining us. So, let's see, are the current participants all from places outside of the US? We've got one from Pakistan, we just heard that. Where's everyone else from? We can introduce ourselves a little bit here while we wait. Yeah, so just a little bit, I'll just kind of give a little bit of an introduction for the content today. So, unsurprisingly, morphology and syntax are, in and of themselves, independent subfields of linguistics. So both of them cover a massive range of topics and can get pretty complicated. So the content that we go over today is necessarily going to be pretty rudimentary and pretty basic. But for people who maybe are working on languages that have not had any grammatical description or are underdescribed, or for whom there is maybe some contention about how to analyze certain parts of the sentence or words, this will just kind of give a basic introduction to some of the foundational principles or foundational ideas behind morphology and syntax. So for those of you who have done some of this kind of work, this may be more of a refresher course than anything else. And for those of you who maybe don't fancy yourselves grammar people, this will be a nice little introduction into how to do some word level and sentence level analysis. And so with that in mind, we're going to be going over the most basic kinds of things and the things that I think we can reasonably cover in a remote workshop such as this. But if there are topics that you're curious about that I didn't touch on during the presentation, do feel free to leave questions and we can get to them in the question and answer section, and I can talk a little bit more about them at the end. I may not have slides to back those up, but we can at least just kind of address some of the basic notions. All right, let's do a little check-ins here, see where we're at in terms of participants. Still only 4? All right, well, you know what, why don't we go ahead and get started. If people join in a little bit later, we can catch them up if need be. All right, so those of you who have been here already heard my little spiel, so I'm going to go ahead and just get started. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So just starting off with a little bit of morphology-related humor. Those of you who are familiar enough with English know that sometimes we like to take words that end with US and pluralize them with an I because that's how it was done in Latin. And so this little illustration makes fun of that. So Gary, you need to be less selfish. Remember, it's cactus. And he says, actually, sweetie, it's cacti. Right? So Gary, the grammar cactus, will never find love. For those of us who really enjoy grammar and find syntax to be really fun, maybe really a little bit to Gary the cactus. But hopefully after today, you'll have a little more appreciation for what's going on behind the scenes. All right, so we're going to start off with morphology. So first of all, what is morphology? Morphology is simply put, the study of words and word structure. So with morphology, we're looking at sort of smaller scope. We're looking at the individual units within the sentence or the phrase. So now the question, of course, is what is a word? And what exactly makes something a word? Well, as I'm sure this will come as no surprise at all to any of you, it varies by language. What constitutes a word can be really different across languages, right? So in some languages, you have lots of little words that all join together to create a cohesive sentence structure. So those are languages like English, or even more, one of the most extreme examples is Chinese. Point to that, where you have lots of individual parts that don't necessarily come together. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a lot of the languages, the Native American languages in the Americas, North America in particular, where you get really long words. Things that look like words are made up a lot of parts that all form a cohesive unit, but they communicate meaning that we would express at the sentence level in English. So it really depends on the language that you're working with, and it can look very different from language to language. But a lot of the basic principles still apply, and we can still sort of analyze them along this with the same basic notions in mind. So as you're describing languages, as you're working with underdocumented languages, it's important to learn about the word structure so that you can describe adequately the processes that the language makes use of in order to form new words. And so we're going to just go ahead and start talking about that. So in and of itself, a word is a piece of language. So words usually, our notion of a word is something that you can say on its own. It's a standalone unit that communicates a piece of meaning. But multiple words can also be strung together in a sentence to create a longer, more elaborate piece of meaning, right? So a word in and of itself can carry certain features that it then contributes to a larger utterance. Now, one thing we need to start off with is to distinguish between what we call an orthographic word versus a morphological word. Now, back in the phonetics and phonology workshop, it was probably pointed out to you that letters do not equal sounds, right? So the ways that we write sounds in a language does not equal the sound itself, because you can have one form that corresponds to multiple sounds, or vice versa, where you have one sound that gets expressed with a lot of different forms. Now, the same is actually true of words. So we have for those who speak European languages, you think of words as being like demarcated in a sentence, so you have a space in between. But there are languages out there, again, like Chinese or Japanese or Thai, where there aren't actually any breaks in the orthography of the word. So we look at that text and we might think, wow, that's just one long string of characters or something. Where do we find those word boundaries? Well, that just comes with knowing the language. So we can't really rely on orthography as a way to judge where the word boundaries are. We have to know actually the internal structure of the language and how it forms words. All right, so the basic building block of a word is what we call a morpheme. A morpheme is the smallest meaning-bearing part of the word, right? So we can break words down, and the smallest we can get, while it still has salient semantic content, is what we would call a morpheme. And there are different kinds of morphemes. So we have bases, and then we have affixes. So the base is the smallest part of the word that carries basic meaning. Now, those of you who have worked in linguistics a little bit more may have also encountered the words stem or root. Now, stems and roots are both forms of bases, but they are a little bit more, the distinction is a little bit more technical. So you're, sometimes even I get it confused, actually. So your roots are the words that you cannot break down any further, right? If you took off another letter, it would just be a meaningless sound form. Whereas a stem could be just a root, or it could be a root plus an affix that then is the base for some other form of word creation, right? So normally this applies to like verbs that are made up of multiple parts and then have further affixation on top of them. All right, so those are bases. Now, affixes are the things that we add to a base in order to change the meaning or to add some kind of grammatical information. And there are multiple kinds of affixes. So I have here definitions of the two most basic forms. We have our prefixes, which are the affixes added to the beginning of the word. And then we also have suffixes, which are added to the end of the word. Now, for those of you who work in Philippine languages, and other language groups have these as well, but we also find that some languages have infixes, where we have a morpheme that we then add to the middle of the word. So for example, like in Amis, a language of Taiwan that I work with, the base, but then if we want to say a person is eating, we add an infix, so we say kumaan, right? So we add it in the middle of the word. Now you can also get circumfixes, so you have two affixes that occur on either side of the base to create a new word. So pulling from another language from Taiwan, yami, the verb walam, means to rest, but then if we add the pi an circumfix and say pi walaman, we get the verb, or the word, the resting place, right? So these are all different kinds of affixes that you'll find. So you can start thinking about in the languages that you work with, what kinds of affixes you find. So as a quick little exercise, let's look at these words in English. So we have unhappy, lovable, and uncomfortable. So you can take a minute to break these down to see what the component parts are. And this shouldn't be too difficult. So I'll give you just a couple of seconds for that. All right, so the morpheme boundaries are as follows. We have unhappy, lovable, and then uncomfortable. So un is a negative prefix attached to the base happy. Able is a suffix that we add to the base love. And then un and able can be used together and added to a base to create the word uncomfortable. All right, now there are also two kinds of affixes that you should be aware of. The first is a derivational affix. So this is the kind of affix that adds new semantic content and can change the syntactic category of the word. So it can change a verb to a noun to a verb to an adjective to a noun to an adjective, etc. All right, so the important part here is that this is adding new information and creating a new word that has some slightly different semantic content. And then you have inflectional affixes, which add grammatical information. So they're not changing the meaning of the word, and they don't change the word class. They don't change the syntactic category. They just simply add grammatical information like tense, aspect, gender, number, etc. All right, so to practice the differentiation between these two, let's take a look at this set of words. And I want you, so we have two sets, two different bases, and then multiple affixes on top of them. So just take a couple of seconds here to look through and see if you can identify, first of all, which affixes are present, and then whether or not they're inflectional affixes. Are they adding grammatical information, or are they derivational affixes? Are they adding new semantic content or changing the meaning of the word itself? The syntactic category of the word itself. So just take a couple of seconds for that. All right, so let's just go through these and talk them through. So for the first set, our base, of course, is read, the verb. And we find reading, which is inflectional, right? So this would be present tense, right? Ongoing marker, so this is a tense marker. The second one, readable, right? This is derivational because we're taking the base verb and turning it into an adjective. Something is readable, able to be read. Reader is another example of a derivational affix. So the er suffix in English indicates a person who does the verb. So in this case, a person who reads. And then that brings us to our last one, reads, where that s is also inflectional, right? So this is person agreement on the verb in the present tense form, right? I read, she reads. So it's agreeing with the third person. All right, now our second set takes the base bright, and we have first derivational affix li, so we have an adjective turned into an adverb, brightly. Brightness takes that adjective and turns it into a noun, right, that ness. And then with the last one, we actually have example of a derivational and an inflectional affix used together. So first we add the derivational affix en, brighten, so that's turning the adjective into a verb, so to make bright. And then the past tense derivational affix ed, so brightened. So there's an example of how both inflectional and derivational affixes can be used simultaneously on the same base. Okay, now sometimes these affixes are going to have the same shape but different functions. So maybe you have an inflectional affix and a derivational affix that look and sound exactly the same. So in order to distinguish between the two, you actually have to look and see what it is that it's doing to the base. Is it adding new semantic content? Can it change the syntactic category of the word? Or is it only adding grammatical information? All right, so some of these affixes, we're going to continue to use English as an example. Some of these affixes, we have seen already in the last couple of sets. So in number 1, writer, composer, hunter, player. So here we have that ER suffix one more time. So this is derivational. It's creating a noun indicating a person who does the verb. Someone who writes, someone who composes, someone who hunts, someone who plays. All right, now in the second one, we have another example of a derivational affix, RE. Reproduce, restore, regain, reload. So this is adding new semantic content, meaning to do again, right? So we're adding it to that base verb and then giving it the meaning to do again. Now the third one, this is where we get the homophonous form, this ER. So rather than creating a noun indicating a person who does the action, what we're getting here is we're changing an adjective into another adjective, a superlative, right? So, or a comparative. Easy, easier, cheap, cheaper, slow, slower, right? So in this case, our base is also a different syntactic category. Our base is no longer a verb, but our base is an adjective. So that's another way you can work to distinguish between the different kinds of affixes, is to see what kind of bases they go to. So normally inflectional affixes are only going to be on verb bases, whereas your derivational affixes can glom onto bases that belong to any syntactic category. Okay, so once again, we have an example of a homophonous affixes here. So just take a quick look. What are the function of these affixes? We have desks, chairs, benches, and then speaks, swims, washes. Pretty simple. So the affixes in one, these are pluralizers. So these are, actually in both cases, these are inflectional, right? So in the first one, they're both adding grammatical information. So in desks, cars, and chairs, we're adding the feature plural, right? But it's not actually changing the meaning. The difference between desk and desks is simply one of number, it's not one of meaning. Same with car, cars, bench, benches. Now in 2, this is person agreement, right? So I speak, she speaks, I swim, he swims, they wash, he washes, right? So in this instance, we have 2 inflectional morphemes that have different functions as well. So that's something else to pay attention to when you're doing morphemic analysis on the language you work for. So just be very careful of homophony, pay attention to what kind of base it takes and what kind of an effect it has, and you'll be well on your way to getting some good morphological analysis. All right, so this kind of word formation, we call these word formation processes, and there are other ways to do it. So affixation is the most common way to form words in a language, but we also have other processes like compounding, where we can create a new word by joining together 2 previous words. So for example, afternoon is composed of 2 words, after and noon, joined together. Same with bedroom, bed, room, joined together. So in this case, we're not actually adding some kind of affix that adds semantic content. This is more of a specification. So we take one noun and specify it by moving it with another noun. So not just any room, but a bedroom, or a bathroom, or a dining room, things like this. All right, now another process common to not just Austronesian languages, but certainly they're notorious for it, reduplication. So this is the formation of new words by repeating part of the word, so either part of the stem or all of the stem. So for example, in Tagalog, we have the verb bili, to buy, and then bibili. So we're just reduplicating that first syllable, becomes will buy. And reduplication as a word forming process can be both inflectional and derivational. So in this example, you'll notice that the difference is it's a tense. It's creating it's adding tense information, right? So we're going from a declarative or present tense to future. But sometimes reduplication can create new nouns or do other kinds of things. So keep an eye out for that. Alternation is when you form a new word by changing the inside of the stem. So in English, foot and feet is an example, or goose, geese, right? Things like this. Other word formation processes you might have heard about. There's one that's inflectional, sort of. That's important. It's called suppletion. So this is when you just change the form of the word entirely in order to accommodate new grammatical information. So a good example of this is like irregular verbs in English. So the be verb, right, to be, we have completely different forms to show different kinds of agreement. So I am, she is, we are. So am, is, are just three completely different forms, but they all are technically inflectional forms of the verb to be. So this we call suppletion. So that's another word formation process that exists. All right, so that more or less wraps it up for morphology. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them now on this particular section before we move on to syntax, and we can get to them at the very end. All right, so moving on into syntax. Syntax it deals with the structure of the sentence as a whole. So how the words that make up a sentence relate to each other and the properties that join them together. All right, so syntax, like I just said, the study of phrases and sentences and their structure. And then the rules of phrase and sentence formation have to do at the most basic level with what we call parts of speech, right? Or maybe you've heard the term syntactic category. This refers to things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, adverbs, things like this, right? These are all things that are parts of speech. And these have really important ramifications for how they fit into the sentence, right? Because your different syntactic categories or parts of speech are going to relate to each other and fit into a broader sentence in different kinds of ways. All right, so now parts of speech in and of themselves are not necessarily given categories. They also vary by language. But at its most basic, there seems to be some good consensus at this point that all languages have at least nouns and verbs. Other categories like adjectives are a little bit more variable. Adverbs, we'll get to adverbs in a minute. Although that question might be a little bit larger, a little bit too big for the workshop today. Okay, so first of all, we're going to talk about nouns. Now, most of you are probably pretty familiar with the concept of a noun. So a noun denotes an identifiable entity, something like a person or an object. For those of you who went to primary school in an English-speaking country, maybe you learned that nouns are people, places, and things and ideas, right? Nouns can also be, they're not necessarily concrete objects like cup or hand or person. They can also be more abstract and refer to abstract ideas or things, right? We can turn actions into concrete nouns, so like run and then running. I like running, the action of running. So you'll notice that ing there is a derivational affix in this case because it's turning a verb into a noun, or running is fun. And now the question now we want to ask ourselves is, how do you identify a noun in your language? What are sort of the hallmark features of a noun cross-linguistically that we can rely on to say this is a noun? And usually the diagnostic for that is that nouns can occur with determiners. So determiners are things like the, or deictic pronouns like this, that, those, things like this. So if you look at the examples down here at the bottom of the slide, we can say the dog, those houses, a linguist, right? So because these are all grammatical in English, we know that dog, house, and houses, and linguist are all nouns. They can co-occur with these determiners. Whereas verbs and adjectives cannot, right? So the is flying is ungrammatical. A shiny is ungrammatical unless we add another noun to it, right? A shiny coin. Or that flown is also ungrammatical. So that's the most reliable way we can say what a noun is. So in your language, you can use determiners or even things like numerals, things like that to determine what the noun category might be. All right, verbs. This is also a very familiar concept. Verbs denote events, processes, and states. So they can be actions like to run, to eat, to drink, to talk. They can also be things like feelings or states of being like sick, to feel hot, to be tired, right? And verbs most commonly occur with tense and aspect. So this is what we use to, this is sort of the main diagnostic we use to identify verbs in any given language, right? So can it occur with tense? Can it occur with aspect? Now tense, as I'm sure most of you are probably familiar, indicates some kind of temporal or time feature of the verb. So tense indicates whether an action occurred in the past or in the non-past. And non-past is just sort of a general category that we use to include present, present continuous, future, right? Anything that's just not finite in the past. So in English, we indicate the past tense with the affix ed. Walk, walked, etc. But we also have some suppletive forms, right? Like am, was, or if you're familiar with strong verb paradigms, drink, drank, things like that. All right, and then aspect indicates whether or not an action is habitual, continuous, or completed, right? So is it still ongoing at the time of the utterance? Has the action been completed at the time of speech, or is the action a habitual one that happens repeatedly or with some regularity? Now, one kind of confusing thing, if you're not familiar with aspect, is that aspect and tense do kind of go hand in hand, but not every language has both of them. And a lot of times they're kind of conflated with each other, but sometimes they're really separate. So for example, Chinese is a language that doesn't have tense, doesn't have grammatical tense. It is an aspect language. So on the verb, you really only you express aspect. Now that doesn't mean that tense isn't communicated. It just means that tense is found in other places. So it's communicated primarily with time words, right? So you'll have, instead of like, yesterday I go would be the equivalent of I went yesterday in English, something like that. So something to pay attention to in the languages that you work with is, where is tense information coming from? Is it on the verb itself, or is it primarily added through adjectives? And then where is aspectual information coming from? That could also be indicated on the verb itself or in some other place. However, I'm digressing a little bit and bringing it back. You want to look at whether, in order to determine whether a word is a verb, you just want to see, can it occur with tense markers? Can it occur with aspect markers? And if the answer is yes, you've got yourself a verb. All right, so now some other major parts of speech. I mentioned adjectives briefly. Adjectives tend to describe properties of nouns, and these can occur with, right, so we're adding some kind of additional information to the noun itself, so like a cup or a white cup or a hard cup or something like this that gives you extra information. Now, in terms of identifying adjectives syntactically, this is a word class that occurs with degree words like very and to, right? So adjectives are states that can be modified by degree. So it can be very something or kind of something or not at all something, right? Now, an important thing to remember is that adjectives are kind of a contested class in the sense that part of speech or syntactic category in the sense that not every language has them. In many languages, adjectives are actually a subclass of verb, and they're what we call stative verbs or adjectival verbs. So using Chinese as an example, again, Chinese is a language that doesn't, strictly speaking, have adjectives. Adjectives are a kind of verb. Now, in these kinds of languages, how do you determine if it's a subclass of verb? Well, the diagnostic we used for identifying verbs was the co-occurrence with tense and aspect markers. So you can take, in order to test it out, you can take an adjective like red in your language and say, can it occur with an aspect marker like become red? Or can it occur with a past tense marker, redden or reddened, right? And if it can, then it's very possible that your language may have adjectival verbs rather than adjectives as a distinct class. So that's something you can definitely look out for and check out. All right, other parts of speech are prepositions. These provide oftentimes spatial information about nouns, verbs, and location, so in, at, nearby. Prepositions often have to do with movement or spatial relationships between objects. Now, prepositions are interesting because they, morphologically speaking, can either be independent standalone words, like in English, where we have in, at, near, or by, or prepositional information or that location information can be expressed as an affix on the noun itself. And this sometimes is called case marking, where you can have like an ablative case or a locative case, things like this. So this would be an affix on the noun that gives you prepositional or spatial information. An example of a language like this would be Finnish, which has a really notoriously complex case system, but a lot of those cases are actually expressing the same kind of information or relationship as a standalone preposition would in languages like English. And then lastly, we have adverbs, which provide information about verbs, adjectives, other adverbs, or entire sentences, right? So in English, this is defined primarily by that ly suffix. So slowly, he walked slowly to the store. Or obviously I'm talking about syntax right now because we're doing a morphology and syntax workshop. Now, adverb is also kind of a tricky category because it can be a bit of a grab bag category where just a lot of things that aren't clearly adjectives, verbs, or nouns, or prepositions, or other parts of speech can kind of be tossed in because this notion of providing extra information to verbs, adjectives, or entire sentences is actually pretty broad. We're not going to get too much into that now. Actually, we're just going to leave it there for now. But if you do have additional questions, you can feel free to ask them at the end, and I will do my best to answer. All right. And something I should note is that things like nouns, verbs, and adjectives are what we call open class categories. So these are parts of speech that we can constantly add new ones to, right? We can create new verbs, new nouns, and new adjectives. But something like prepositions, these are closed class categories, so we cannot add new members to them. We don't just create new prepositions, right? There's a fixed set of them in any given language, and we just use those. So something to keep in mind. All right. Now, different languages in their syntax have different word orders, right? So those of us who speak European languages are most familiar probably with subject-verb-object or subject-object-verb word ordering, right? So English is SVO, but a language like German is often SOV. Those of you who work with Austronesian languages or particularly Philippine-type languages will be, even Oceanic and Polynesian, will be really familiar with this verb-initial pattern, so verb-object-subject or verb-subject-object. So typologically, the subject, I believe SVO is the most common type. And then the verb-initial ones are not uncommon, but less common. And then the most uncommon form is to have some kind of object-initial word ordering. So this is definitely something to look at in your own language and something to be sensitive to, because sometimes languages allow different kinds of word orders, and that word ordering will have different kinds of syntactic or grammatical ramifications. So there might be a reason to have a particular order, and then there might be a reason to switch it up. Also, some languages are more strict in their word orders. So a language like English is actually pretty rigid in the ways that we put our words together, but other languages can be a bit more flexible. So these languages often have like case marking systems. So in a language like German or Korean or Japanese, where all of your nouns are marked, they morphologically are marked for their syntactic category. And in these languages, there's a preferred word order that people most like to stick to, there is a certain amount of variation that's acceptable because of the fact that these components are grammatically marked for what role they play in the sentence, whereas in English, that role is marked by its position, so that word order is actually pretty strict and fixed. All right. So there's a couple different types of phrase and sentence types that we're just going to quickly go over. So the sort of baseline phrase type or sentence type that we often talk about in linguistics is a declarative sentence. So this is just a statement of fact. The child is sleeping, that child broke the bowl, that child is not sleeping, right? It can be affirmative or negative. We're just stating a fact. And these are the sentences that most readily conform to the word order types we just looked at: subject, verb, object, verb, etc. A common type of pattern is existential pattern, like there is a child. So you're pointing out or stating the existence of a thing. Now in English, we use a demonstrative pronoun, there, plus the verb to be, in order to form existentials. Some languages will use an existential verb in order to express that, so they have a special verb for it. Other languages might use word order patterns or some other kind of strategy to express existentials. So you can check that out in your own language and see what strategies are used. In terms of asking questions, this is another type. There are often two types of question patterns. We can have yes-no questions. Did that child break the bowl? Yes, they did. No, they did not. Right? These are the sorts of questions that simply elicit a yes or a no answer. And then we have WH questions, which we also sometimes call content questions, where we're asking for more than just affirmation, or what's the opposite of affirmation? Whether or not something is true. So WH questions, who broke the bowl? So we're actually asking for content. Who was it? It was Jim who broke the bowl. Or Jim broke what? What did Jim break? Jim broke the bowl. Right? So you're actually asking for content. And these are usually, so the terminology is English-based. We call these WH words. But that just refers to the words in the languages you work with that indicate who, what, when, where, why. Right? These, in English, most of them start off with WH. Oops, sorry. There we go. We also have prepositional phrases. These are the ones that start with prepositions and express locational or spatial information. On the desk, below the ground, towards the sun, away from the mountains, things like this, right? So they have a preposition that indicates the direction of movement or the relative spatial relationship. And then we have noun phrases. Noun phrases we have a noun head, and then anything that's modifying the noun, usually determiners and adjectives, right? So bright red backpack. So we could have backpack, the bright red backpack, a bright red backpack, right? These are all noun phrases. And all of that content can fit into sort of the noun slot within any given sentence. And then lastly, we have possessive noun phrases. So Jackie's wild horses, my cup, the teacher's explanation. So this expresses some kind of a possessive relationship between whether it's concrete possession or some kind of abstract possession between the person who owns it and then the thing itself. So when you're working with your own language, if these are things that you don't know already, this is a really good place to start to just sort of get a sense of like what the word order and what the structure is in this language. So for each of these sentence types, going through and saying, all right, how does this language express these? What is the word order that's used? What words occur where? What kind of grammatical markings occurs when things are in particular places? And how do they compare to each other, right? Is there any sort of relationship between the different structures or strategies used for these different sentence types? So that can be a really good place to start with if you're doing morphosyntactic description for the first time with a particular language, or if your language is well described. Oftentimes these particular sentence types or patterns can be talked about more extensively as they compare to other languages as structures, or maybe if you're more of a theoretical syntactician, how that adds to our understanding of syntactic theory is in terms of like how these phrases are structured. All right, so that's beyond the scope of our current talk, but something to think about as you continue to work with the sentence types and structures. All right, so now getting into the actual documentation side of things, once you have some language data written down, and once you've done a bit of an analysis of the sentence, what you want to do before you archive your data is you want to gloss it. All right, so glossing just means that we transcribe the language's morphology and syntax. So this means that when we're writing it down, we just sort of note, like, this morpheme does this is the root, this is what it means, this morpheme does this is what this particle is, and going through. Now, these days, the sort of gold standard for glossing any kind of a text are the Leipzig glossing rules. And we'll add a link to that in the Facebook post after we're done. But you can also just Google search Leipzig glossing rules and it will come right up. There's a nice PDF that gives you the full rundown of how to do it, but we'll just kind of go over some of the basics here. So commonly we refer to this kind of glossing as interlinear glossing, where you have 3 lines in your text. So at the very top you have the text in the language being studied. Underneath that you have a morpheme by morpheme gloss, where you're indicating the translation or meaning of each morpheme and stem. And then under that you have a free translation that just gives you the meaning of the sentence in the working language. So whether that's English or Chinese or Indonesian or whatever, that's going to be your translation of the sentence. So if we take a look at this Tagalog example, kinain kuang ista, I probably didn't pronounce that right, but that's okay. This is the original Tagalog phrase. Right underneath that, we have the morpheme by morpheme gloss, right? So we have our base, kain, to eat, with our infix, in. And that's indicated down here with eat, and then our infix, which in this case is a perfective, so it's an aspect marker. After that, we have ku, which is a first singular ergatively marked particle, so me. And then our absolutive argument, ang, and then the noun, ista. This is a determiner, so this is occurring with a noun, creating a noun phrase. This is what we might call the agent argument. And then under that, our translation, I ate the fish. So this is a very common way of glossing our language data. All right, so to take an example that more of us maybe have access to looking at English, what we need to do before we can really gloss is break down the words into their component morphemes and understand what each morpheme does. So if we take the English sentence, the dogs are barking at my friend. The is a determiner, right? We know that those co-occur with nouns. Dogs, we have our root dog and then the inflectional affix s indicating plurality. Are, which is the be verb. And you notice here that we have be and are, that's a suppletive relationship, right? So they just use a completely different form to convey different grammatical information. And that grammatical information is marked right here, third person plural. So that's the agreement. Next we have our root bark, and then the inflectional affix ing indicating progression, progressive aspect. Then at, this should be marked preposition. my, which is a first singular possessive pronoun, friend. And then we just have friend because that's a noun base. All right, so this is a good example of what glossing looks like in a language like English. So in whatever language you're working with, you're going to do something very similar where for each word and each morpheme, you're going to indicate what it is that that morpheme is if it's providing grammatical information, or what it means if it's a base and it only contains semantic content. All right, and then there's different ways to sort of format your glossing, but just the general standard is that you align each morpheme with its gloss. So typically you're going to do word by word and then break that up, and you're going to indicate morpheme boundaries with a dash, as you can see here in the middle. So dogs, that dog and S separated by a dash, barked, the root, the base, and the past tense marker separated by a dash. And then similarly in the gloss, those components will be separated by a dash as well, whereas between words, that word boundary won't have any special marking, it'll just be a space. And then if there's grammatical content that's not easily separated out because it's not a separate morpheme, you can indicate that with a period. So for example, mice and mouse, this is another, suppletive relationship, right? So mice is the plural, and we indicate that as mouse.pl. Or for ran is the past tense form of run, so there's not an independent morpheme indicating the past tense, it's just a full new form, so we can just say run.pst for past tense of run. And you saw that if we go back to my, that's a first singular possessive, so it's a possessive pronoun indicated by the period, or barking, with R, that's the be verb, agree with third person plural agreement. Okay, so that's the general basics of the Leipzig glossing rules. For the abbreviation conventions, go ahead and just check out the PDF that of the Leipzig glossing rules. It gives you a really nice list of all the ways to abbreviate, and if the thing that you want to abbreviate is not on the list, you can just make up your own. It's pretty simple. The crucial thing with glossing, though, is that however you end up glossing it, just to stay consistent. And it's really okay, as you are working with the language, if your analysis changes, to go back and change your glossing. Like that's pretty flexible. Like just because you've glossed it one way in the past doesn't mean that your analysis can't change and you can't go back and re-gloss it a different way in the future. Because for those of us, for languages where maybe the function of some of the affixes isn't quite clear, you still have to gloss it in some way, and you can just sort of choose a way to do it for now, or choose a way that best reflects your understanding of it, and then go back and re-gloss it later once you think you understand it a little bit better. All right, so as an activity, and we are not going to do this now, but you can take this and go apply it to whatever languages that you're working with on your own. The first step is just to identify different affixes in your language, right? So find if your language has affixes. Not every language has affixes, but if it does, identify them. Try to identify what their function is. Are they derivational? Do they create new words, add new semantic content, or are they inflectional, and do they only convey grammatical information? And then you can look for other morphological processes in your language, or other word formation processes in your language. Does your language use compounding? Does it use reduplication? Are there suppletive or alternative ways of conveying different semantic content or different grammatical meaning in the words? As a next step, you can take our list of basic phrase structures or sentence structures and observe how those are manifest in your language, what strategies it uses to deal with that, and how it expresses them. And then for those who want to take it one step further, you can see how that compares with other related languages or unrelated languages so that you have a better understanding of the sentence level structure. And then the last part, if you have any kind of documentation or record already of your language, you can add to it. Last time when we were talking about metadata and archiving, I believe Leah brought up the program Flex. So for those of you who are PC users, Flex is a really excellent tool where you can build a dictionary and you can input morpheme information into the dictionary itself. And then when you input a text, it will auto-gloss it for you. So based on the dictionary that you've compiled. So you just input a sentence and it will break it apart and tell you like, oh, this has these affixes in it, this word means this, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can go in and manually check to see if things are actually correct and it's done its job. Because glossing a lot of language data by hand is exhausting for those of you who may have had some experience with that. Okay, Here again is just that list of different sentence structures, and these slides will be on our website, so you can always just download these and take a look at them later for future reference. And that actually concludes our talk for today, and I've neglected to put a thank you slide, but yeah, thank you all for joining. This was our introduction to morphology and syntax. I hope you all found it useful, and now we will turn to the Q&A.
People saying hi from different places.
Hello, welcome.
Complete.
Okay, so someone pointed out that in our Tagalog example from here, the CV reduplication is actually marks the completive form, so it would be contemplative? Completive? In any case, I glossed this wrong here, so this is not a future marker. It's not will by, it has a different meaning. But this CV reduplication in Formosan languages, for example, oftentimes will mark the future tense as well. So excuse me for that. Thank you for pointing that out. I will change these slides before we put them up on the Facebook page. All right, let's see if we have any other questions.
No questions, just people saying hi from Nigeria.
Okay, great. All right, well, we are just about at our time limit. It doesn't look like we have any follow-up questions here, which is totally fine. I know this is a lot of information and a lot to process. So if you feel you have questions after the fact or think of something tomorrow or the next day, do feel free to leave a comment on our Facebook page underneath this Morphology Syntax Talk, and we'll be sure to get back to you on that. But for the meantime, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Bye.